What would you do if you found out the monster under your bed was actually a family member? My 7-year-old cousin Angie started having nightmares whenever she had to go home after staying at our house. She'd cling to me begging not to go back to her dad's. When I asked her why she got quiet and said her dad played games she didn't like at bedtime, my blood went cold because I knew exactly what that meant. Her dad used to get creepy with me when I was younger, and everyone convinced me I was imagining it. I wasn't about to let Angie go through the same thing. I immediately told my mother, but she said I was misunderstanding what Angie meant. That kids say strange things and I shouldn't jump to horrible conclusions about Uncle Todd. She said Todd was a good father and I was being dramatic because I watched too much true crime. I went to my aunt, Todd's ex-wife, who had shared custody, and she broke down crying saying she'd tried to tell the court, but Todd's lawyer made her look like a vindictive ex trying to get full custody. The judge had actually given Todd more custody time because my aunt was making false accusations. She told me she'd spent $30,000 on lawyers trying to protect Angie, but Todd had convinced everyone she was mentally unstable. I called CPS and they said without physical evidence or Angie explicitly stating what happened, they couldn't investigate based on vague comments about bedtime games. The social worker actually warned me that false accusations could result in me being sued for defamation. I took Angie to her pediatrician for a checkup hoping they'd find something, but the doctor said there were no physical signs, and children often resist going home for normal reasons like preferring one parent's rules. That's when it hit me that he'd positioned himself perfectly to look like Father of the Year. He was on the PTA board, had donated thousands to the school, he was involved with Angie's school, coached her soccer team. He was untouchable. I tried recording Angie talking about it, but she was too scared and would just shut down. She'd been trained not to tell, threatened with something that kept her silent even with me. I found out from another parent that Todd always volunteered to drive multiple kids home from practice, but always dropped Angie off last, meaning they were alone in the car for sometimes an hour. My aunt tried to get a restraining order, but the court said there was no evidence and she was harassing Todd. They threatened to give him full custody if she kept making accusations. The judge specifically said she was lucky he didn't hold her in contempt for wasting the court's time with unsubstantiated claims. I stayed at Todd's house one night, pretending I needed a place to crash, and heard him go into Angie's room at midnight. When I tried to follow, the door was locked. I knocked and he came out acting normal, saying Angie had a nightmare and he was comforting her. Angie was under her covers, completely silent, not moving. The next day, she wouldn't talk to me at all and had bruises on her wrists that Todd said were from falling at the playground. Todd knew I knew, and he pulled me aside and said if I kept spreading lies about him, he'd make sure nobody ever saw Angie again. I laid awake all night, realizing I had a choice to make. Try expose him and risk Angie's life, or let the abuse go on. I made my decision the next morning. I walked into the police station. I laid out everything I had for the officer. Todd's entire web, how he was untouchable, how he threatened Angie's life. And yet, according to them, without Angie's testimony or physical evidence, there was nothing they could do. I kept pressing them, however, refusing to let Angie become like me, but that's when the officers became hostile. Listen, ma'am. The officer rolled his eyes. Todd and I attend the same church. I speak to him a lot. He's a good Christian man going through a difficult divorce. Don't add to his plate. I left the station scared. If the officer knew Todd, he'd tell Todd I came in. And that threat, nobody would ever see Angie again, suddenly seemed way more real. That night, Todd called me. I heard about your visit today. His voice was calm. Angie and I are taking a little vacation. She needs a break from all this stress you're causing. The line went dead. When I called back, the number was disconnected. I spent all night calling every hotline and authority I could think of. I drove to Todd's house and screamed and pounded on the door until the neighbors called the police on me. I texted Angie everywhere I could and got no response. I was hopeless when my aunt called me crying the next morning with even worse news. Todd had filed for emergency full custody and gotten a restraining order against both of us. He'd submitted photos of me sitting outside his house, my unhinged police report, and 3 doctors' statements saying Angie was being traumatized by our harassment. The hearing was tomorrow. Angie didn't show up for school that day. The principal called my aunt saying Todd had mentioned possibly homeschooling Angie due to family issues affecting her education. I called 911 reporting a kidnapping. That's when the final blow happened, when the police arrived at his house. Todd was forced to finally open the door. However, he had paperwork. A judge's order, he had medical recommendations, even a brochure for his therapeutic retreat in Mexico that Angie's therapist signed off saying was beneficial for her mental health. Everything was legal and perfect. I watched the officers walk away, knowing I had to save Angie. My legs wouldn't move for what felt like forever as I stood there on Todd's driveway watching the patrol car turn the corner. The neighbor who'd called the cops was still watching from her window, and I forced myself to walk to my car before she called them again. I sat behind the wheel for maybe 10 seconds before something inside me shifted, like a switch flipping from panic to cold focus. Todd had paperwork, but paperwork could be challenged with better paperwork. I drove home and pulled out a legal pad, writing down every single option I could think of while crossing out the ones that could backfire. Call CPS again from a different county, file complaints with the state board, contact the FBI about crossing state lines, get media involved, hire a private investigator. Everything went on the list. By 3 in the morning, I had pages of notes with most options crossed out, but a few circled that focused on creating official documentation that couldn't be dismissed as harassment. I grabbed my phone and Googled domestic violence hotlines until I found one that operated 24 hours. The woman who answered listened to me explain everything about Angie and Todd and the Mexico plan without interrupting once. She told me about resources I'd never heard of, including something called a child advocacy center and pro bono lawyers who specialized in cases like this. She stayed on the phone with me for over an hour, telling me I wasn't crazy and that what I was seeing was real abuse even if the system wasn't responding properly yet. The next morning, I called the lawyer she'd recommended, Elena Page, who picked up on the second ring. I explained everything from Angie's bruises to Todd's church connections to the Mexico retreat that was really a camp for healing false memories, according to their website. Elena didn't dismiss anything or tell me I needed more evidence. She just asked specific questions about dates and documentation. She explained that we needed to file an emergency motion to prevent Angie from leaving the state and push for something called a forensic interview at the Child Advocacy Center, where trained specialists could talk to Angie. She warned me Todd's lawyers would fight it hard, but said we had a real chance if we moved fast and smart. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table typing out a sworn declaration on my laptop, documenting every single thing I'd witnessed, including Angie's exact words about the bedtime games, the locked door at midnight, the bruises on her wrists, and the church officer telling me Todd was a good Christian man. Getting it all down on paper made it real in a way that felt both terrifying and powerful. My aunt came over the next morning with her own stack of papers, court documents from her divorce showing every time she'd tried to protect Angie and been shut down. She wrote her own declaration about the $30,000 she'd spent on lawyers and how Todd's attorney had made her look crazy in court. We were finally working together instead of fighting this separately. Both of us focused on one thing, which was keeping Angie safe. I called Angie's school and asked to meet with the counselor that afternoon. Not the principal who Todd had donated money to, but Helena Sims, who'd been there for years. Helena took detailed notes as I explained my concerns about Angie's safety and the Mexico plan, nodding when I mentioned the bruises and missed school days. She pulled up Angie's attendance records right there, showing me the pattern of absences after Todd's custody weekends and the nurse's report from last week about bruises on Angie's arms. Helena said she was filing a mandated report that day as a school official, which would create an official paper trail that couldn't be ignored like my personal complaints had been. She also implemented what she called a safety plan, where Angie would check in with her every morning, and Todd would have to sign her out in person if he tried to remove her from the school. That evening, Elena filed our emergency motion to prevent removal from the state, along with a request for the court to order a forensic interview at the Child Advocacy Center. We submitted everything electronically, including my declaration, my aunt's declaration, and Helena's initial safety plan documentation. Elena said we'd probably get a response within 48 hours, but warned me Todd's lawyers would come back swinging with accusations that we were harassing him. I spent the rest of that night setting up cameras at my apartment and changing all my passwords because I knew Todd would try to intimidate me now that we'd filed official court documents. My phone rang constantly with unknown numbers that I didn't answer, and I saw that same church officer's patrol car drive slowly past my building twice before midnight. The phone woke me up at 7 the next morning, and the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. A woman introduced herself as a CPS worker from the neighboring county who'd gotten the school's mandated report. She said Helena's documentation had triggered a new intake, and she wanted to meet with me that day. Her voice sounded different from the first worker, more concerned, and she asked specific questions about the bruises and Angie's behavior changes. She mentioned coordinating with something called a Child Advocacy Center for a special interview with Angie. I wrote down everything she said and agreed to meet her at 2 that afternoon. After hanging up, I called Elena to update her, and she said this was good news since a different county meant less local influence. I got dressed and drove to the Child Advocacy Center address the CPS worker had given me. The building looked like a regular house from the outside with a playground in the back. Inside, a woman named Adriana Curry met me in a room filled with toys and comfortable furniture. She explained how they do trauma-informed interviews with children in a safe environment while recording everything. She showed me the special room where kids can talk without feeling pressured or scared. But then she dropped the bad news that without a court order or Todd's consent, they couldn't interview Angie yet. They were ready the moment we got clearance, but their hands were tied by legal requirements. Adriana pulled out a map and showed me how close the Mexican border was to our town. She explained that Todd could legally take Angie anywhere in the country and even internationally without our permission. Unless we got a specific court order preventing travel, he had every right as the custodial parent to leave. My stomach dropped as I realized how much danger Angie was really in with that Mexico retreat plan. Elena met us there and immediately started drafting an emergency motion for a hearing the next day. She typed furiously on her laptop while Adriana gave us copies of their interview protocols and research on trauma responses in children. We spent 3 hours going through everything and building our case for why the court needed to act immediately. That's when Elena's phone buzzed with an email notification from Todd's lawyer. The response they'd filed was brutal, accusing me of coaching Angie and manufacturing evidence to help my aunt's custody case. They demanded sanctions for harassment and wanted us to pay all their legal fees. The lawyer called our emergency motion frivolous and said we were abusing the legal system. They even included a declaration from Todd saying I'd been stalking his family and traumatizing his daughter. Elena said this was typical intimidation tactics, but it still made me feel sick reading their lies. I left the advocacy center and drove home, noticing a patrol car parked across from my building. It was the same church officer from before, just sitting there watching my apartment. When I went inside and looked out my window, he was still there, not even trying to hide. I took photos with my phone and texted them to Elena, who told me to document everything, but warned that filing a complaint might backfire. The officer stayed there for 2 more hours before finally driving away slowly. That night I couldn't sleep, so I started securing everything I could think of. I changed every password on my accounts, making them all different and writing them down in a notebook. I went to the store and bought a prepaid phone for talking to Elena and my aunt, without Todd potentially tracking us. The security cameras I'd ordered online had arrived, so I installed them at my door and windows. I made sure they uploaded to the cloud automatically, so even if someone took them, the footage would be saved. Everything got documented in a folder I was keeping with dates and times and photos. Around 10 that night, my regular phone rang with an unknown number. When I answered, a man said his name was Cullen Pennington, and he was an investigative reporter. Someone had tipped him off about our case and the pattern of institutional failures protecting kids. He wanted to look into the bigger picture without using our names, focusing on how the system fails families. I was nervous about talking to media, but Elena had said publicity might help protect Angie. Cullen agreed to meet me at a coffee shop the next morning to discuss what he was investigating. He promised complete confidentiality and said he was more interested in the systemic problems than our specific case. The next morning at the coffee shop, Cullen showed me articles he'd written about other custody cases gone wrong. He asked if I had any documents I could share, and I hesitated, not wanting to violate any court orders. Elena had given me permission to share redacted versions of our public filings, so I gave him those. He took notes about Todd's connections to local officials and the church officer who kept dismissing concerns. Cullen said he'd start looking into campaign donations and other financial connections without mentioning our names. He gave me his card and said to call if anything else happened that showed the pattern of protection Todd was getting. After Cullen left, I got a text from another soccer parent asking if we could talk. She came to my apartment that evening and told me she'd noticed Todd always volunteering to drive kids home. She'd thought it was nice of him until she realized he always dropped her daughter off first, and Angie last. That meant Angie was alone with him in the car for sometimes over an hour after practice. She agreed to write a statement about what she'd observed and sign it for our court filing. It wasn't much, but every piece of evidence showing Todd's pattern of isolating Angie helped our case. The next morning, I drove to the courthouse and filed public records requests for any police reports from Todd's address. I also requested body cam footage from when the church officer dismissed my concerns at the station. The clerk said it would take up to 30 days to process, but Elena could file a motion to expedite for the hearing. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I opened my laptop and started searching for information about the Mexico retreat Todd had mentioned. I typed in the name from the brochure and found the website right away. The place looked nice in the photos, but something felt wrong about the language they used. They talked about helping kids overcome false memories and reconnecting families torn apart by misunderstandings. I clicked through page after page and found parent testimonials about how the program helped their children remember the truth about loving family members. My hands started shaking when I found a discussion forum where former patients described being forced to recant abuse claims. One girl wrote about being kept there for 6 months until she agreed her father never touched her. Another kid said they used isolation and took away meals if you didn't participate in the healing sessions. I took screenshots of everything and sent them to Elena at 2 a.m. She texted back immediately saying this was exactly what we needed for court. The next morning, we rushed to the emergency hearing, and the courtroom was packed with people I didn't recognize. Todd sat at his table looking calm while his lawyer shuffled papers. The judge came in, and Elena stood up to present our evidence about the retreat. She showed the screenshots and explained how these places operate outside U.S. jurisdiction. The judge looked at the papers for a long time before speaking. He said the evidence was concerning, but not enough for a full travel ban yet. We had 72 hours to gather more proof, or Todd could legally take Angie anywhere. I wanted to scream, but Elena squeezed my arm to keep me quiet. After court, I drove straight to Angie's school and met with Helena in her office. She had already started putting safety measures in place that morning. The principal agreed to call us immediately if Todd showed up to withdraw Angie. Helena also set up a code word system with Angie so she could signal if she felt unsafe. It wasn't much protection, but every little bit helped. That afternoon, I met Adriana at the Child Advocacy Center to discuss next steps. She explained they needed either a court order or CPS request to interview Angie formally. We were waiting on both, and every hour that passed felt like lost time. Adriana showed me the interview room with toys and art supplies designed to help kids feel safe. She promised they were ready to move fast once they got permission. Meanwhile, Elena was working on another legal motion from her office. She filed paperwork to force the forensic interview based on all the reports we now had. She included Helena's documentation and notes from Angie's therapist about behavioral changes. The therapist had noticed Angie regressing to younger behaviors and wetting the bed again. Elena said judges pay attention when multiple professionals raise concerns. While she handled the legal side, Cullen was digging into Todd's connections. He called me that evening with interesting findings about campaign donations. Todd had given thousands to several local officials, including 2 judges and the district attorney. Cullen also found deep connections between Todd and the PTA board members. He was drafting an article about conflicts of interest in child welfare cases, without using our names. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with boxes of old photos and printed text messages. I spread everything out and started creating a timeline of Angie's injuries and behavior changes. There was the wrist bruise from 3 months ago that Todd blamed on the playground. Then the photo from her birthday where she looked scared sitting next to him. Each picture hurt to look at, but we needed this evidence organized. My aunt came over to help and brought something important. Her therapist had written a professional summary of what she'd observed about Angie. The report detailed sleep problems, bedwetting, and fear responses that matched trauma symptoms. We added it to our growing file of evidence that something was very wrong. The next afternoon, while I was organizing papers, someone knocked on my door. A process server handed me legal documents and left without saying anything. Todd's lawyer had filed a notice accusing me of harassment and threatening contempt charges. The papers said if I contacted Todd or Angie again, I'd face jail time. Elena called it an intimidation tactic, but said it actually showed they were getting worried. She filed a response pointing out that I hadn't contacted them directly since the restraining order. Between all the court dates and meetings, my work was falling apart. I'd missed 3 shifts and my boss was running out of patience. I sat down with him and explained I needed to reduce my hours temporarily. He wasn't happy, but agreed to let me work part-time while this was going on. I couldn't afford the pay cut, but I also couldn't focus on anything except saving Angie. The stress was affecting everything, and I knew I had to pace myself for what might be a long fight. Elena called me that afternoon and said she was filing an internal affairs complaint against that church officer who dismissed me. She explained it probably wouldn't do much right away, but we needed everything documented. The complaint detailed how he knew Todd personally and refused to take my concerns seriously. She included the fact that he'd warned Todd about my visit, which showed clear bias. While Elena handled that paperwork, I got a call from a CPS worker I'd never talked to before. She said she was from the neighboring county and had picked up Helena's report from the school. This worker sounded different, actually concerned instead of dismissive. She asked detailed questions about what I'd observed and said she was scheduling a home visit with Todd. I spent the rest of that day on the phone with the State Department asking about parental abduction resources. The woman I talked to explained they couldn't do much without a court order, but helped me register some basic alerts. I wrote down every step I was taking in a notebook, documenting all the protective measures even if they seemed small. The next morning, I drove to Todd's church to request a meeting with the leadership about his behavior. The pastor's secretary took my information, but when the associate pastor came out, he immediately started defending Todd. He said Todd was a pillar of their community and going through a difficult time. I recorded the date and time they refused to investigate in my notebook. That same afternoon, Cullen called with interesting news from his research. Another parent had approached him with concerns about Todd but was too scared to go on record. This parent had noticed weird stuff during soccer practices, but Todd had connections everywhere. The fear Todd created in our community ran deep, but at least cracks were starting to show. Elena was busy that week subpoenaing records from Angie's therapist who'd signed off on that Mexico retreat. When the documents came through, she found something huge. The therapist had been getting referral kickbacks from the program, actual financial connections that could invalidate their recommendation. She immediately filed this with the court as evidence of conflict of interest. 3 days later, we finally got notice that the court scheduled an emergency hearing about the travel restrictions. But Todd's lawyer immediately requested a delay, claiming they needed time to prepare. The judge gave them a partial continuance, which meant 3 more days before we could argue our case. It felt like both a small victory and a dangerous delay since Todd could still leave. Elena and I spent hours preparing a motion to recuse the original judge who'd been so dismissive of my aunt. We'd found records showing Todd had made campaign donations to him. The motion got denied initially, but Elena said it was flagged for review by the Judicial Ethics Committee, which was something. That's when everything accelerated in a scary way. The school's automated system sent an alert to Helena about a travel form submitted for Angie. The form showed flight plans for next week to Mexico City. Helena immediately called me, and I called Elena, who started drafting emergency paperwork. We couldn't wait for the scheduled hearing anymore. Elena got us a rushed mini-hearing for the next morning by explaining the flight risk to the court clerk. At that hearing, Todd's lawyer argued that Angie needed immediate medical treatment that was only available at this specific facility in Mexico. The judge looked skeptical, but didn't issue a full travel ban like we'd hoped. Instead, he ordered Todd to provide 48-hour notice before any international travel. It wasn't the full restriction we wanted, but at least it gave us warning and time to respond legally if Todd tried to leave with Angie. The very next morning, Todd's lawyer filed another motion, claiming Angie needed immediate medical treatment that was only available at that specific Mexico facility. Elena called me as soon as she saw it on the court system and said the lies were getting more desperate now. The motion included fake medical documentation, saying Angie had developed severe anxiety that required specialized treatment outside the country. I couldn't believe how far Todd would go to get her away from everyone who could help her. That afternoon, I decided to try something different and called a police station in the next town over for a welfare check. I explained about the locked door pattern from when I'd stayed at Todd's house and asked them to check on Angie. 2 officers from that precinct actually went to Todd's house while he was at work, and the babysitter let them in. They documented everything, including the lock on Angie's bedroom door that could only be opened from the outside. The babysitter told them Todd always kept that door locked at night, and she wasn't allowed to go near Angie's room after bedtime. The officers wrote all of this in their report, which became crucial evidence we could actually use in court. Elena immediately submitted this police report along with all our other documentation to push for the forensic interview we'd been trying to get. 2 days later, the court finally signed an order compelling Todd to bring Angie to the Child Advocacy Center for an interview. Adriana called me right away and scheduled it for the next morning at 9 o'clock sharp. We all held our breath, hoping this would finally give Angie a safe space to tell someone what was happening to her. But 9 o'clock came and went with no sign of Todd or Angie at the advocacy center. Adriana waited until 10 before calling to confirm they weren't coming, and Todd's phone went straight to voicemail. His lawyer filed a document an hour later claiming Angie was too sick with the flu to attend the interview. Elena was on it immediately and filed an enforcement motion for Todd's noncompliance with the direct court order. She attached the police welfare check report showing Angie had seemed fine just 2 days earlier when the officers visited. The judge called an emergency hearing for that afternoon, and I watched from the gallery as he got visibly angry. He issued a much stronger order saying Todd had to produce Angie within 48 hours or he'd be held in contempt of court. The Mexico trip was officially paused, and Todd couldn't take Angie anywhere until he complied with the interview requirement. That same evening, Cullen's first article went live on the local news website about systemic failures in protecting children. He didn't use any names, but the patterns he described were clearly about our case and similar ones in the area. The article got shared hundreds of times within hours, and people started commenting about their own experiences with the system failing kids. The pressure was building, and Todd's connections couldn't make this kind of public attention go away completely. The next morning, the church officer called Cullen trying to figure out who his sources were for the article. Cullen recorded the whole conversation where the officer kept asking specific questions about Todd, without Cullen ever mentioning him. This created documented proof of the connection between Todd and the officer that supported our bias complaint perfectly. Cullen sent us the recording, and Elena added it to the internal affairs complaint we'd already filed about the officer. 3 days later, Internal Affairs officially opened a preliminary inquiry into the officer's conduct with findings due in 30 days. It was slow, but at least someone was finally taking the officer's dismissive response to my initial report seriously. The investigation meant he couldn't just brush this under the rug anymore and had to answer for his bias. That evening my phone rang, and it was my mother calling to yell at me about the embarrassment I was causing the family. She'd seen Cullen's article, and even though no names were used, she knew it was about us and Todd. She kept saying I was ruining the family's reputation and making everyone look bad with my accusations. I told her protecting Angie mattered more than what people thought about us, and hung up on her mid-sentence. It was hard cutting her off, but I couldn't let her guilt trip me into backing down when Angie needed help. My aunt called me crying the next day because Todd's process servers kept showing up at her apartment with legal papers. They were harassing her constantly, and she was scared to leave her home or answer the door anymore. She packed a bag and temporarily moved in with a friend whose address Todd didn't know to get away from the intimidation. We started coordinating everything through Elena now, so my aunt and I didn't have to deal with Todd's legal harassment directly. Elena became our shield and made sure all communication went through proper legal channels, instead of Todd trying to scare us. The 48-hour deadline for Todd to produce Angie was approaching fast, and we all waited to see what would happen next. 2 days later, Todd showed up at the Child Advocacy Center with Angie looking pale and quiet, in a dress I'd never seen her wear before. Adriana met them in the waiting room and explained the process while Todd kept his hand on Angie's shoulder the whole time. When Adriana took Angie back to the interview room, Todd demanded to go with her, but Adriana calmly explained parents weren't allowed during forensic interviews. I watched through the observation window as Angie sat on a small couch clutching a stuffed bear, while Adriana asked gentle questions about her home and school. For the first 20 minutes, Angie barely spoke above a whisper, and kept looking at the door like she expected Todd to burst in. Adriana asked about bedtime routines, and Angie's whole body went stiff before she started talking about brushing her teeth and picking out pajamas. When Adriana asked if anyone ever made her feel uncomfortable, Angie started crying and said Daddy got mad when she didn't play the special games right. She wouldn't say what the games were, but she showed Adriana on a doll where Daddy touched her sometimes, and my stomach twisted watching her small hands point to areas no child should have to explain. The interview lasted an hour, and while Angie didn't say everything, she disclosed enough that Adriana documented clear indicators of inappropriate contact in her formal report. The next morning, we took Angie for the court-ordered medical evaluation at the hospital, where a specially trained nurse examined her while my aunt held her hand. The physical exam found some redness and irritation, but nothing conclusive since it had been days since Todd's last unsupervised visit. The nurse documented behavioral indicators, though, like Angie's extreme anxiety during the exam and her knowledge of adult terms she shouldn't know at 7. The medical report noted these findings were consistent with abuse even without definitive physical evidence. 3 days later, we all packed into the courtroom for the emergency hearing where the judge reviewed both the Advocacy Center report and medical evaluation. Todd's lawyer argued the findings were vague and could indicate anything, but the judge wasn't buying it this time. After reviewing everything, the judge ordered an immediate ban on international travel and mandated that all of Todd's visits would be supervised at a professional visitation center starting immediately. My aunt grabbed my hand so tight I thought she might break it as we heard those words. Todd's lawyer immediately stood up, claiming we had coached Angie and demanded the appointment of a guardian ad litem to independently evaluate what was really in Angie's best interests. The judge agreed and appointed a woman named Sarah who would interview everyone and observe Angie with both parents over the next week. Sarah started her evaluation the next day by meeting with Angie at the school where Helena had set up a private room for them to talk. Then she observed Todd's first supervised visit at the center where Angie sat frozen on a chair while Todd tried to act like the perfect father for the supervisor. Sarah took notes on how Angie flinched when Todd reached for her and how she wouldn't make eye contact with him the entire hour. The next day, Sarah observed Angie with my aunt at their apartment where Angie was completely different, laughing and playing and climbing into her mom's lap for hugs. Sarah interviewed me, and I told her everything I'd witnessed, including the locked door that night, and Todd's threats about making sure nobody would see Angie again. She interviewed Helena, who shared her observations about Angie's behavior changes and the attendance records showing a clear pattern. The school sent over documentation showing Angie had perfect attendance and grades when staying with her mom, but missed multiple days and had behavioral problems after Todd's weekends. These records from neutral school officials who had no stake in the custody battle became crucial evidence that something was clearly wrong during Todd's time. A week later, the internal affairs report came back, finding the church officer's dismissive response to my initial report was inappropriate and showed clear bias. They recommended reassignment to a different precinct and mandatory retraining on handling abuse allegations. It wasn't the full accountability we wanted, but at least it validated that we were right about him protecting Todd instead of investigating properly. Word spread quickly through the church community, and within days the officer was quietly removed from his volunteer security position at Sunday services. The soccer league also got wind of the situation through parent gossip and suspended Todd from his coaching position pending the outcome of the custody case. The community shield that had protected him for so long was finally starting to crack as more people learned the truth. I started seeing a therapist myself to deal with everything that was happening and the memories it was bringing up from my own childhood. She helped me understand how my experience with Todd when I was young was driving both my determination to save Angie and my guilt about not speaking up sooner. We worked on setting boundaries with my family and dealing with my mother's continued denial about what Todd was capable of. After 2 weeks of evaluations and interviews, Sarah submitted her report to the court, recommending that my aunt receive temporary primary physical custody, with Todd limited to supervised visits only. She documented Todd's controlling behavior during visits, and Angie's visible fear responses compared to her relaxed, happy demeanor with her mother. The judge reviewed everything at the next hearing and granted my aunt temporary custody, with Todd getting 4 hours of supervised visitation per week at the professional center. Angie would be safe while the longer legal process played out over the coming months. Todd's travel company called my aunt 3 days later about his canceled Mexico booking. He was fighting them for a full refund even though the court order made it clear he couldn't leave the state. The company rep told my aunt they'd already flagged his passport with authorities after receiving the court paperwork. Todd spent hours on the phone screaming at their customer service, but they wouldn't budge on their cancellation policy. His perfect escape plan had crumbled, and now he was stuck paying for a trip he couldn't take. The PTA board held an emergency meeting that week after Cullen's article went viral on local parent Facebook groups. Parents were demanding answers about volunteer screening and transportation policies. The board voted to require background checks for all volunteers and ban the practice of one adult driving kids alone. The soccer league followed suit the next day with new rules requiring 2 adults present for all transport. Todd's pattern of always dropping Angie off last would never be allowed to happen again. My aunt called me that Saturday morning about a safety planning workshop the Domestic Violence Center was offering. We spent 4 hours learning about creating backup plans and building support networks. They taught us how to document everything properly and set up emergency contacts at the school. We practiced what to do if Todd showed up unexpectedly or tried to take Angie without permission. The facilitator helped us create code words Angie could use if she felt unsafe. We left with binders full of resources and phone numbers we hoped we'd never need. Angie's first appointment with the trauma specialist happened the following Tuesday. The therapist spent an hour just playing games with her to build trust. My aunt waited in the lobby reading the same magazine page over and over. When Angie came out, she was holding a stuffed bear the therapist gave her for being brave. They scheduled twice-weekly sessions, and the therapist explained it would take time for Angie to feel safe enough to talk. Adriana from the Child Advocacy Center joined some sessions to help reinforce that telling the truth was the right thing. Angie started opening up more each week, and the therapist documented everything carefully. Elena called us 2 weeks later about filing for a permanent protection order. She'd been gathering every piece of evidence we had into a massive filing. The evidentiary hearing was set for 2 months out, which felt both too far away and too soon. She needed witness statements from the school counselor and the new CPS worker. We spent hours going through timelines and making sure every detail was documented. Elena said our case was getting stronger with each new piece of evidence. She was confident the judge would see the pattern of abuse Todd had hidden for so long. My mother showed up at my apartment unexpectedly on a Thursday evening. She stood at my door holding a casserole dish and looking uncomfortable. She said she'd been thinking about everything, and maybe she'd been too quick to dismiss my concerns. She still worried about what people at church were saying, but she could see Todd wasn't who she thought. She didn't fully apologize, but admitted she should have listened better. I took the casserole and thanked her for what she could give. We didn't hug, but she squeezed my hand before leaving. It was more than I expected and less than I needed, but I'd take it. Something shifted in me after that visit. The frantic desperation that had been driving me for weeks started to settle. I stopped checking my phone every 5 minutes for updates. I started sleeping through the night without nightmares about Angie. My role changed from warrior to support system. I went to my aunt's house to help with normal things like homework and dinner. We played board games and watched movies without talking about Todd or court dates. Angie started laughing again during our Saturday baking sessions. She still had bad days, but the good ones were getting more frequent. My aunt was finding her strength too and didn't cry every time we talked anymore. We were learning how to live with the situation instead of just surviving it. The supervised visitation center sent reports each week about Todd's visits with Angie. He got 4 hours every Sunday in a room with cameras and a social worker present. Angie would come back quiet but not terrified like before. The supervisor noted that Todd followed all the rules, but Angie remained withdrawn during visits. He kept trying to ask her about what she'd told people, but the supervisor would redirect him. These reports went straight to the court file as more evidence of his inappropriate focus. Tonight, I'm sitting on my aunt's couch while Angie sleeps safely in her own bed upstairs. The schedule on the fridge shows supervised visits and therapy appointments for the next month. The emergency is over even though the legal case continues. Angie hasn't had nightmares in 2 weeks and she's back to doing well in the school. My aunt has full custody for now with Todd limited to those supervised visits. We know there's still a long road ahead with the permanent order hearing coming up. But for tonight, knowing Angie is safe in this house, protected by court orders and surrounded by people who believed her, feels like the biggest victory we could ask for. That's the story from my side. Now I want to know what you think. Would you have handled it differently? Leave a comment below. I'll be reading through them. Your takes always make this more fun.